My grandparents had saved $85,000 for my education, but my parents secretly gave it all to my spoiled sister to buy her a brand new car. When I confronted them, they just told me to let it go. Hi Reddit, I'm Nathan, and if there's one thing I've learned, it's that some people will take everything you give them and still expect more. I used to believe that if you worked hard, played by the rules, and did right by the people around you, life would reward you for it. Turns out I was wrong. I grew up in the shadow of my older brother, Carter. He was the loud, charming, effortlessly likable one, the kind of guy who could talk his way out of any situation. From the moment we were kids, it was clear he was the favorite. If Carter wanted something, he got it. If he messed up, my parents smoothed it over. If he succeeded in even the smallest way, it was celebrated like a historic achievement. Me? I was there, the second son, the afterthought. It wasn't that my parents were cruel. They just had a way of making it clear in 1,000 small ways that Carter came first. I ran track in high school, broke records, won state championships. My mom would smile and say, "That's nice, honey," before launching into a story about Carter's basketball game. Never mind that he spent most of his time on the bench. When I got into a great college on a scholarship, my dad congratulated me with a pat on the back before turning to Carter and asking how his weekend plans were going. Even when I landed a high-paying job right out of school, it was barely acknowledged. Meanwhile, Carter got a promotion at his part-time job and my parents threw a family dinner in his honor. I told myself I didn't care. I was building my own life, making something for myself, and I didn't need their validation. And for a while that was enough. Until everything changed. When I was 25, my parents announced that they were retiring. It wasn't a discussion, just a statement of fact. My dad sat me down one evening and told me they couldn't keep up with the house payments and the cost of living on their retirement income alone. Then, as if it were the most natural thing in the world, they asked me to move back home and help out. At the time, it didn't seem like a big deal. I had been renting a small apartment and figured I could save money by living at home for a while. They made it sound temporary, just until they got their finances sorted. So I packed up my things and moved back into my childhood home, believing I was doing the right thing. Looking back, I should have seen the signs. First, it was small things. I chipped in for groceries, helped cover a portion of the mortgage. Then I started paying for the utilities. Then household repairs. Then little upgrades my mom wanted, a new dishwasher, fresh paint for the living room. Slowly, the financial burden shifted onto me, and I barely noticed it happening. Meanwhile, Carter was living in a luxury high-rise downtown, driving a brand new car, taking weekend trips to expensive resorts with his wife, Olivia. Every time I saw him, he had a new complaint about how tough things were, how rent was too high, how his car payments were killing him, how hard it was to make ends meet. I kept waiting for my parents to suggest that he help out too, that maybe, just maybe, we should be splitting the responsibility. But they never did. Instead, they sympathized. They shook their heads and sighed about how unfair life was to Carter, how expensive everything had gotten. And then they turned to me, their responsible son, and thanked me for being so reliable. For a long time, I told myself it didn't matter. I was helping my parents. I was doing my part. But every now and then, I'd catch myself wondering, if Carter had been the one in my position, would they have expected the same from him? Or was I just their safety net, their backup plan, the one they could rely on because they knew I wouldn't say no? I buried those thoughts, told myself I was being paranoid. But deep down, the truth was already settling into my bones. I was being used. And one day, they would throw me away just as easily as they had come to depend on me. I woke up early every morning, leaving for work while my parents were still having their coffee. My days were long, filled with spreadsheets, meetings and deadlines, but I didn't mind. Work gave me a sense of purpose. It was a place where my efforts actually mattered. Unlike at home, where everything I did was expected but never acknowledged. Evenings at the house followed the same pattern. My mother would be watching TV, my father would be reading the paper, and the moment I stepped through the door, they would greet me with a list of things that needed fixing. "Nathan, the sink's been leaking all day," my mother would say. "The garage door won't close properly. Can you take a look?" My father would add, barely glancing up from his reading. It was never a request, just an expectation. And I would sigh, loosen my tie, and get to work while my mother tooted about how Carter was so busy these days, always running around, always working so hard. Must be exhausting for him, she'd say, shaking her head. I don't know how he does it. I knew exactly how he did it. By dumping all responsibility onto me. It wasn't like I never saw my brother. He visited every now and then, usually when he needed something. He'd walk in like he owned the place, flashing that easygoing smile, giving my mother a kiss on the cheek, slapping my father on the back. Man, I miss this place, he'd say, stretching his arms like he was reminiscing about some long-lost paradise. Hey, Nate, how's life treating you? It was never a real question. He never cared about the answer. Then, without fail, the conversation would turn to him. His job, his problems, his latest financial struggles. Olivia and I have been thinking of getting a second car, he said one evening, plopping down on the couch while I stood in the kitchen, still in my work clothes. But you know how it is, money's tight. Tight? The man lived in an upscale apartment, drove a car that cost more than my entire year's salary, and took vacations to luxury resorts every other month. My mother made a sympathetic noise. Oh, sweetheart, things are so expensive these days. I don't know how young people manage. Carter sighed dramatically. Right? If only I had a little more breathing room, things would be so much easier. I could see where this was going before he even got there. Man, Nate, you're lucky you don't have to deal with rent, he said, giving me a pointed look. I mean, you're living here practically for free. My grip on my glass tightened. For free. I paid the mortgage. I covered the bills. The groceries. The maintenance. Every single expense that kept this house running. But to Carter, none of that mattered. Because he had never had to take responsibility for anything in his life. I didn't respond. There was no point. My parents were already nodding along, murmuring about how hard life was for Carter, how unfair it all seemed. I excused myself before I said something I'd regret. Later that night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I realized something that made my stomach twist. Carter wasn't the problem. He had always been this way. The real problem was my parents. They had spent his entire life making excuses for him, enabling his worst habits, shielding him from consequences. And now they were using me to do it. The next day at work, I couldn't focus. The numbers on my screen blurred together. I kept replaying the conversation from the night before, hearing Carter's voice in my head, that smug, careless tone. You're living here practically for free. As if I were the freeloader. As if I owed them something. At lunch, I pulled out my phone and started looking at apartments. Not just browsing, not just entertaining the idea, but seriously searching. I had spent the last few years telling myself that this was temporary. That I was just helping out. That eventually, things would even out. But they never would. It was time to start thinking about myself for once. The thought of leaving stayed with me for days, clinging to my mind like an itch I couldn't scratch. But every time I let myself imagine packing my bags, getting my own place, stepping into a life that was mine and mine alone, something held me back. Guilt? It had been drilled into me for as long as I could remember. The idea that family came first, that sacrifices were just part of the deal, that it wasn't about what I wanted, it was about what I owed. And then there was my mother. She had a way of making me feel like the worst person in the world without ever raising her voice. Nathan, sweetheart, she said one evening, stirring a pot on the stove while I leaned against the kitchen counter. Could you pick up some groceries tomorrow? We're out of a few things. A few things. That was what she always said. But I already knew what would happen. I'd go to the store, spend $200, and come home to find that half of it was for Carter's favorite snacks. I opened my mouth, ready to say no. Ready to tell her that I wasn't made of money, that I wasn't her personal ATM, that I was tired. But then she sighed, her shoulders slumping just slightly. A small, practiced movement, but I felt the weight of it anyway. I just don't know how we would manage without you. I clenched my jaw so tightly it hurt. That was how she did it. Not by demanding, not by yelling, but by making me feel like I would be abandoning them if I ever put myself first. And I fell for it. Every time. But that night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, something inside me snapped. How long was I going to let this continue? How long was I going to pretend that my life belonged to me when every choice I made revolved around keeping my parents comfortable and Carter happy? I turned over, shutting my eyes. Tomorrow, I told myself. Tomorrow, I start looking for real. But tomorrow came with another surprise. I walked into the kitchen the next morning, groggy and half awake, only to find Carter sitting at the table with my parents, his hands wrapped around a steaming mug of coffee. Nate, he grinned like he hadn't just been insulting me a few days ago. Man, you look like you need a vacation. I ignored him and reached for the coffee pot, but my father cleared his throat. We need to talk, son. That tone. That careful, weighty tone he only used when he was about to ask for something unreasonable. I exhaled through my nose, already bracing myself. About what? My mother smiled, the kind of smile that was meant to soften bad news. Carter and Olivia are in a bit of a rough spot, sweetheart. I glanced at my brother. He didn't look like someone who was struggling. He looked well-rested, well-fed, like someone who had just walked out of a high-end gym after a personal training session. Oh, I said, crossing my arms. That's too bad. Carter let out a dramatic sigh. Yeah, man. Life's been kicking my ass. Rent keeps going up and Olivia's been stressing about money. It's just been a lot. I stared at him, waiting for him to get to the point. My father did it for him. We were thinking, he said, that it might be best if Carter and Olivia move in here for a while. Just until they get back on their feet. Silence. A slow, creeping kind of silence that filled every inch of the kitchen, pressing against my chest. I looked between them, my fingers tightening around my mug. You can't be serious. My mother blinked as if I was the one being unreasonable. Sweetheart, it's just temporary. You know how hard things are for young couples these days. I laughed. A sharp, humorless sound. Carter lives in a luxury apartment, drives a new car, and takes vacations every other month. And you expect me to believe he's struggling? My brother's smile flickered. Come on, Nate. It's not that simple, No, it is that simple, I snapped, my voice sharper than I intended. I'm the one keeping this house running. I'm the one paying the bills. And now you want me to make room for Carter? Are you serious? My father's expression darkened. Watch your tone. Watch my tone? I wanted to scream. Wanted to grab something and throw it. Instead, I took a deep breath, forcing my hands to unclench. I'm not doing this, I said, my voice cold. You can't seriously expect me to just step aside after everything I've done for you. My mother's lips parted, her eyes widening in something that looked almost like hurt. Nathan, she said, soft and wounded. We thought you'd want to help your brother. There it was. The guilt. The carefully placed dagger aimed straight at my chest. I swallowed hard, my throat tight. My father exhaled through his nose. Nathan, it's time for you to start thinking about your own future. Maybe this is the push you need to get your own place again. You've been here long enough. I stared at him. My mother reached across the table, placing her hand over mine. You are thinking of moving out soon, aren't you? I opened my mouth, but no words came out. Because the truth hit me like a freight train. They weren't asking me to move out. They were telling me. They had already made their decision. And in their minds, it made perfect sense. I had been useful when they needed me. But now that Carter needed something, I was disposable. I pulled my hand away from my mother's grasp. I didn't argue. Didn't yell. I just stood up, grabbed my keys, and walked out the door. And for the first time in my life, I finally saw my family for what they really were. I drove aimlessly for hours, my knuckles white against the steering wheel. I wasn't even sure where I was going. I just knew that if I stayed in that house 1 second longer, I would say something I couldn't take back. Or worse, I'd let them talk me into staying. Because that's how it always worked. My mother would soften her voice, my father would say something about responsibility, and Carter would just sit back, letting them do the work, knowing he'd get what he wanted in the end. Not this time. I pulled into an empty parking lot and turned off the engine. My hands were shaking. My breath came in uneven, angry bursts. How had I let it get this bad? How had I not seen it? I had spent years convincing myself that I was being a good son, that I was helping my family. But the truth was simpler than that. I was a paycheck to them. A convenience. And the second I wasn't useful anymore, they had no problem throwing me aside. My phone buzzed. A text from my mother. We know you're upset, sweetheart. Come home and we'll talk this through. I stared at the message, my jaw clenching so hard it ached. Come home. Like I wasn't already home. Like the place I had spent years paying for didn't belong to me in any real way. I shut off my phone and leaned back against the seat, exhaling slowly. No more. No more excuses. No more guilt. No more waiting for them to finally see me as more than Carter's shadow. I needed to leave. Not in a few months. Not when it was convenient. Now, by the time I returned to the house later that night, my decision was made. The front door creaked as I stepped inside. The lights were still on. My parents sitting in the living room. Carter lounging comfortably on the couch like he already owned the place. My mother looked up, smiling in relief. Oh, Nathan, there you are. I cut her off. I'm moving out. Silence. Carter shifted slightly, like he was suddenly paying attention for the first time. My father set down his book, his expression unreadable. Nathan, let's not be hasty. This isn't hasty. I said. I should have done this a long time ago. My mother's smile faltered. Sweetheart, we didn't mean to upset you. We just thought. You thought I would just go along with it. I snapped. Like I always do. My father exhaled through his nose, rubbing his temple. No one's forcing you, Nathan. We just assumed you'd want to take the next step in your life. You're not a kid anymore. I laughed, the sound bitter. Now I'm not a kid. But when you needed me to pay for everything, I was responsible enough, right? Carter let out a short breath, shaking his head. Man, you're blowing this out of proportion. I turned to him, my pulse hammering in my ears. I've paid for this house for years. The mortgage, the bills, the groceries, everything. And now you want me to step aside so you can move in? And I'm the one blowing this out of proportion. Carter rolled his eyes, but he didn't argue. Because he knew. My mother reached for my hand, but I pulled away before she could touch me. I'm done, I said. I'm not paying for anything anymore. And I'm not coming back. My father's expression darkened. Nathan, don't be rash. We're family. I met his gaze, my chest tight with years of pent-up anger. Then maybe you should have treated me like it. I turned and walked upstairs. I heard my mother call my name, but I didn't stop. I didn't hesitate. I was done. I started packing that night. I moved like a ghost through the house, silently pulling my belongings from drawers, stuffing clothes into bags, carefully stacking the few things I actually owned into boxes. The house was quiet except for the occasional muffled voices of my parents downstairs. Their conversation too low to make out but urgent enough that I knew exactly what they were talking about. Me. Carter had already disappeared into the guest room, probably feeling satisfied with himself, already picturing how he'd redecorate once I was out. I gritted my teeth and kept moving. I didn't take everything, just the essentials, just enough to walk out and never look back. At some point, I heard soft footsteps outside my door, a hesitant knock. Nathan, my mother's voice, quiet, careful. Can we talk? I took a slow breath. I'm busy. A pause. You don't have to do this, she said gently. I finally turned to the door. Do what, Mom? Set boundaries? Stop letting you walk all over me? I could almost hear her flinch. That's not fair. I let out a humorless laugh. Fair? You want to talk about fair? Nathan, sweetheart, we love you. We just want what's best for everyone. Everyone? I repeated, shaking my head. You mean Carter? Silence. I waited. I wanted her to deny it. I wanted her to tell me I was wrong, that I mattered just as much, that they had never meant to treat me this way. But she didn't. She just sighed, soft and weary, like she was exhausted by me. I turned back to my suitcase, shoving another shirt inside. I'll be gone by the end of the week. Another pause. Then, quietly, your father's going to be disappointed. I clenched my jaw so hard it hurt. Not she was disappointed. Not they were disappointed. Just him. Because my mother never truly argued with my father. She just made things happen in the way she wanted, manipulating without ever raising her voice. And my father? He had always played the role of the quiet authority, letting my mother handle the emotional side of things while he delivered the final verdict. But the truth was they were a team, and their decision had already been made. I was just making it easier for them. I didn't say anything else. Eventually, she walked away. I kept packing. I spent the next few days silently moving things out, little by little. I didn't want a dramatic exit. I didn't want a screaming match. I just wanted out. But on the third night, Carter finally decided to have his say. I had just come back from dropping off another load at my new apartment when I found him sitting in my room, casually flipping through one of my old notebooks, like he had every right to be there. I stopped in the doorway, my stomach twisting. Get out. Carter smirked but didn't move. Come on, man. Don't be like that. I clenched my fists. I'm not joking, Carter. Get out. He sighed dramatically and set the notebook down. All right. Just wanted to check in, you know. I scoffed. Yeah? Suddenly worried about me. Carter leaned back against my desk, arms crossed. Look, I get it. You're pissed. You think Mom and Dad screwed you over. And okay, maybe they did it. I let out a sharp laugh. Maybe? He ignored me. But it's not like I forced them to do it, man. It's just the way things worked out. The way things worked out. Like this was just some inevitable, unavoidable outcome. Like I had just been unlucky. My hands curled into fists. You're unbelievable. He shrugged like none of this affected him. Because it didn't. You'll be fine, he said. You always land on your feet. I stared at him, barely able to believe the words coming out of his mouth. You really think that, don't you? My voice was shaking. You think I'll be fine, so it doesn't matter what happens to me. Carter finally pushed off the desk, stretching like this whole thing bored him. Look, man. We all have our roles in life. You've always been the responsible one. The guy who takes care of things. And me? I'm the one who takes, I cut in. His smirk faltered. I shook my head, breathing hard. You don't care, do you? Not about me. Not about what you've done. You expect this. He exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. Man, you're really dragging this out. Something inside me snapped. I stepped forward, forcing him to look at me. Do you even realize what I've given up for this family? I put my entire life on hold for them. I drained my savings. I worked overtime. I gave up having my own place, my own life, so they wouldn't lose this house. Carter's expression flickered like he almost understood. But then, just as quickly, he let out a small laugh, shaking his head. Jesus, Nathan. You sound like Mom. That did it. I shoved him. Hard. He stumbled back, eyes widening in shock. And for the first time I saw fear in them. Because I had never fought back before. I had never stood up for myself. I stepped forward, my voice low and furious. Don't you ever compare me to her. Carter swallowed, looking away. I took a slow breath, shaking my head. Enjoy your new life here. Because I'm never coming back. I grabbed the last of my things and shoved past him. And this time he didn't try to stop me. The night I left, the house was silent. No goodbyes. No last minute please. Just the sound of my own footsteps echoing as I carried the last of my boxes down the stairs. I expected my parents to say something. To at least pretend they cared. But my father didn't even look up from his newspaper. My mother sat stiffly on the couch, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her lips pressed into a thin, unreadable line. Carter wasn't there. I paused at the door, gripping the handle, waiting for something, anything, to make me hesitate. But there was nothing left. No lingering attachment. No false hope that they would suddenly see me, really see me, and ask me to stay. I stepped outside and shut the door behind me, locking away years of resentment, sacrifice, and disappointment. And I didn't look back. For the first time in years, I was free. I moved into a small apartment across town. It wasn't much, just a one-bedroom with outdated carpets and a flickering kitchen light, but it was mine. No one could take it from me. No one could guilt me into giving it up. At first, I felt relief. Then, exhaustion. Because once the anger faded, I realized just how tired I was. Tired of carrying everyone else's burdens. Tired of proving myself to people who never cared. Tired of hoping, even after all this time, that maybe my parents would miss me. But they didn't. Weeks passed and I didn't hear a word from them. No calls. No texts. Nothing. And that should have been the end of it. But then, late one evening, my phone buzzed. At first, I thought it was a mistake. I hadn't saved the number, but I recognized it instantly. My mother. For a second, my thumb hovered over the screen. Then, against my better judgment, I answered. She didn't even say hello. Nathan, she said, her voice thin and brittle. We need to talk. I sighed, already regretting picking up. What do you want, Mom? A pause. Then carefully, it's about the house. I closed my eyes, already knowing where this was going. Let me guess, I said flatly. Carter's not helping, and now you're struggling to pay the bills. Silence. I laughed. It was bitter and humorless because of course this was happening. You really thought he'd step up, didn't you? I shook my head. That's on you. Nathan, please. And for the first time, she sounded desperate. Not the usual manipulation, not the guilt-laced softness she always used to get her way. Actual, real desperation. I hesitated. Because as much as I hated it, as much as I had every reason to ignore her, I still wasn't them. What happened? I finally asked. She exhaled shakily like she had been holding her breath. It's bad, Nathan, she admitted. The bank is threatening to foreclose. I ran a hand down my face. How? Because I had kept that house afloat for years. There was no way they could be this deep in trouble this fast. Unless I froze. Mom, I said slowly, dread curling in my stomach. Tell me the truth. Did you take out another loan? Silence. And that was all the confirmation I needed. Unbelievable, I muttered. It wasn't my idea, she rushed to say. Your father thought it would help. And Carter, I let out a cold breath. Carter what, Mom? She hesitated. And suddenly I knew. The weight of it hit me all at once. They hadn't just borrowed money to keep up with bills. They had been bailing Carter out. Again. How much? My voice was tight, controlled. Nathan. How much, Mom? A beat of silence. Then, finally, almost 70,000. I actually had to sit down. 70,000. I laughed, shaking my head. Jesus Christ. Are you serious? She sniffled. We didn't have a choice. Carter was in trouble, eh? I cut her off. Carter is always in trouble. And you always fix it. Her breath hitched like she was actually surprised at my anger. Like I didn't have every right to feel this way. Nathan, she whispered, if we don't pay soon, we'll lose the house. Something inside me twisted. Because for a split second, the old guilt tried to creep back in. I had lived in that house my entire life. I had saved that house. And now, after all the years I spent keeping it together, it was slipping through their fingers. I took a slow breath. And then I asked the one question that truly mattered. What do you want from me, Mom? Another pause. Then, softly, we were hoping you could help. Of course. That was the real reason she called. Not to apologize. Not because she missed me. Because she wanted money. I shut my eyes, pressing my fingers against my temple. You mean, I said, voice low, you were hoping I would fix it. Just like I always do. More silence. And then, in the smallest voice, please, Nathan. My grip on the phone tightened. And for the first time in my life, I didn't feel torn. I didn't feel guilty. Because in that moment, I realized something. They had never seen me as family. Only as a solution. And I was done being their solution. So I exhaled slowly, steadying myself. And I said the one thing I should have said a long time ago. No. My mother gasped. Nathan, please? I said no. Nathan, if we lose the house, I don't know what we'll do. That's not my problem. Her breath caught, and for the first time, I heard something new in her voice. Panic. Nathan, she whispered. We're your family. I let out a humorless laugh. No, I said. I was just your safety net. And then I hung up. I blocked her number. And as I sat there in the quiet, heart pounding, something settled inside me. For the first time in my life, I was free.